Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Life Sciences in Focus webinar. I'm María Mateos. I'll be your moderator. And today we have a terrific group of guests who will introduce themselves in a moment. I'm sure some of you may met them already. But first, let me start with a couple of housekeeping items so that everyone who is joining us today knows how to participate in this webinar. So there's a Q&A tab. Please use it to enter your questions for the panelists. We'll have time to address those in the last quarter of the hour or so. There's also a live channel. Feel free to connect with other attendees there and tell us where you are logging from. We're curious to know. And for those with accessibility needs, you can turn on Zoom's automatic caption feature. That should help. And if you want to connect with any of the speakers today, please send me a message by LinkedIn or email me afterwards, and I will make sure to facilitate that. This session is being recorded, so you will receive a replay by email in the next few days. And we're going to start with a short presentation to frame the topic we have prepared for you today, and then move on to a discussion. So let's leave the panelists introduce themselves. Julie, would you like to start?
Yes, good morning to everyone. My name is Julie Blasingim. I'm the CEO of Univo IRB, and if you're not familiar with Univo, I'm hoping to introduce you to our services. Univo has re-entered the IRB space as an alternative option. We're solely focused on bringing the voice of patients to the forefront of research and really taking that voice of patient and figuring out how we can help people understand research and see it as part of the healthcare journey. So thanks for having me today. Looking forward to contributing to the panel.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to have you here. Ella, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on this webinar. My name is Ella Balasa. I am a patient advocate living with a rare genetic lung disease called cystic fibrosis. And I'm also a patient expert and patient engagement consultant, and really helping organizations, healthcare companies to integrate the patient voice and perspective throughout drug development and really bridge the gaps and the barriers between patients and the broader healthcare industry. I work with a number of different organizations, from startups in the digital health space to CROs and biotechs. And really, I'm excited to be on this conversation and looking forward to the topics that we cover. And I'll hand it to Deborah.
Thank you, Ella. And yes, Deborah.
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me again, Maria, and thanks to Julie and Ella for being a part of this. My name is Deborah Bates. I'm a Vice President of Clinical Operations at Tranquil Clinical Research, and we are quite an amazing early phase CRO and early phase 1 CRU, which is a clinical research unit. I've been in the industry about 25 years at this point, and Tranquil has been around for 10 plus years and still growing. Our offices are located in Houston, and that's where our phase 1 unit is as well. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this as we get into the presentation, obviously, but I'm so happy to be here talking about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. So thank you, Maria, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, it's a pleasure to have the three of you here. I really can't wait to hear where the discussion goes. So, Deborah, if you're ready, I'll pass the torch to you.
Absolutely. Perfect. So we are going to be talking about breaking barriers, enhancing diversity and inclusion in clinical research. So to get started, I want to just tell you a little bit of a story about a man named Ernest Hendon. Ernest was one of approximately 600 Black men in the United States who unwittingly participated in the U.S. Public Health Service study, the effects of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. Most of you will have heard of this before as the Tuskegee study. He passed away in January 2004 and was the last survivor. Basically, this study was of untreated syphilis in males, and it started in 1932. These individuals were not consented to be on study. They were not told what they were being studied for. They were just told they were being treated for bad blood. In Ernest's own words, I was a nobody, and all the men included in the experiment were nobodies, so there wasn't a lot to say about it for years. In 1943, there was a treatment available for syphilis. None of these men who had syphilis received that treatment or were made aware of that treatment. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal presidential apology for the individuals who were part of this study. Men who were poor and African American without resources and few alternatives believed they had found hope when they were offered free medical care by the United States Public Health Service. They were betrayed. This gives you just an idea of some of the background and the history and why we have some of the issues we're going to talk about in terms of health equity and research equity and so on and so forth. In today's society, the stress of navigating a lifetime's worth of racism has damaging health effects. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has found that Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related illness or injury than white women as a result. And this is not just ethnic groups and racial groups who are underserved, who suffer from health inequities, but there's transgender individuals as well. A June 2020 Center for American Progress report indicated that 68% of transgender people of color experienced mistreatment by a medical professional. So you can see there's a lot of history, there's background, and there's what's happening in society that affects health equity and research equity. And this doesn't just apply to transgender individuals, minorities, ethnic groups. This actually applies to women as well. We're 3 women on this panel today. And, things are starting to change, but in terms of research equity, we still see, especially in medical devices, only about 1/3 of research participants are women. In 2019, about 41% of research participants in drug studies were women, whereas they are for 51% of the US population. So you can see we still have a ways to go here. So let's get into it. When we talk about health equity, health equity is created when individuals have the fair opportunity to reach their fullest health potential. And achieving this health equity requires reducing unnecessary and avoidable differences that are unfair and unjust. And you'll see that health equity is really related to research equity. They go hand in hand. And some of the many causes of health inequities relate to obviously social and environmental factors, including income, social status, race, gender, education, and even the physical environment. According to the World Health Organization, people's living conditions are often made worse by discrimination, stereotyping, and prejudice, and that can, again, be based on a number of different factors. But these discriminatory practices are often embedded in institutional and system processes, so it's really at higher levels, and it has to be broken down. But I think what today we can talk about is how we break it down at a research level and how we break it down at a site level to get people into research and participating. So I love this graphic. It comes from Nationwide Children's Org, and it really illustrates the idea of research in health equity and the difference between equity and equality. And you can see here, fairness doesn't mean, and this is a quote by author Rick Riordan, fairness doesn't mean everyone gets the same. Fairness means everyone gets what they need. And so a long-term strategy for health equity and research equity has to be boosting up those individuals in those underserved communities who need that extra boost, who need those extra pieces to help them to facilitate their participation in research and their health equity, basically. So the FDA's been involved in pushing this, and it's part of their mandate moving forward. The Office of Minority Health and Health Equity aims to enhance equity in clinical trials by identifying barriers to clinical trial enrollment, and we'll be discussing quite a few of those in a few minutes. Improving data collection and data quality for underrepresented populations in clinical trials. Employing innovative strategies, trainings, education, and communication methods to increase clinical trial enrollment in underrepresented populations. And increased training for diverse clinical trial investigators and other researchers. I think you're all familiar with the FDA guidance that came out in June 2024, requiring sponsors to have a diversity action plan. For drugs, this needs to occur when we get to phase 3 study or as appropriate, basically a pivotal clinical study for a drug. For devices, the plan must be included in the IDE application for clinical studies of a device. And sponsors need to consider whether certain demographic groups, older patients, pediatric patients, females, a particular race or ethnic group, have different responses to medicinal product. And there have been studies that have shown there's a lot of differences. There's differences in how different races and ethnicities metabolize drugs between men and women, female and male differences in how drugs are metabolized, reactions, adverse reactions, those types of things. So it's very, very important to have all groups who are going to be taking the medicinal product or using that medical device appropriately represented in the clinical trials that are studying these for safety, for efficacy, and so on and so forth. So the FDA's guidance says that a diversity action plan must include the sponsor's goals for enrollment in clinical study, disaggregated by race, ethnicity, sex, and age group of clinically relevant study populations, the sponsor's rationale for such goals, and the sponsor's explanation of how the sponsor intends to meet such goals. And here's the crux of it. So it's very easy to write this on paper, and it's somewhat easy to put words to a plan, but then how do you implement that plan? How do you do this in real life? Because it's very easy to talk about this, but once you look at how this is going to play out, it's a bit of a different story. So now we're going to just take a look at some of the factors that need to be addressed in order for us to have research equity. So here's some of the factors that I've laid out, and these are by no means full and complete. It's just a list of things that come to mind when we think of addressing some of the barriers for research equity. Number one is language barriers and translation of study documents. And obviously Vistatec is hosting this, and they have a big part to play in how we overcome these types of language barriers, translation of documents, but not just translation of documents, there's other barriers as well. There's barriers for transportation and location. Now, for location, that, from a site perspective, obviously our location is what it is. We can't change it. From a sponsor's perspective, though, they have to take a look at where the locations of study sites are, because of the fact that, if they're in hard to reach areas, if they're in locations where it's primarily white Caucasian individuals who live in those areas, that's going to determine the population that comes in study. And we'll talk a little bit about this more. The generational distrust of research and the stigma. So we just talked about the story of Ernest Hendon. This generational distrust has continued and still continues to this day. And it's very hard to overcome that. So this is really, really critical and important. The awareness, availability, time, and access. Often underserved populations don't have the time, don't have the same resources, don't have the same access. And then a big one is lack of insurance. Again, this is a big barrier for a lot of people. And in a lot of cases, the way that studies are put together and protocols are written lead to having kind of excluding non-insured persons, not in so many words, but it ends up being that way. So what can we do? Well, here's just a few solutions that come to mind. Obviously ensuring that all patient-facing documents are translated, but also having the availability of interpreters. And Maria's kindly been working with me for our site because, we have the way our site is made up, we are quite a diverse group of nurses, nurse practitioners, coordinators, and doctors working. But we can't be, inclusive of every single ethnicity possible and have every different language. So in the United States, Spanish obviously is big, and we do have Spanish-speaking individuals who work for us. But when we're looking at perhaps doing Asian bridging studies, for example, at our facility, we are looking at the availability of interpreters, to actually have interpreters who are there. Even if someone does speak English, if their primary language is Japanese and they're more comfortable in that language, then we want to eliminate that barrier. We want to have an interpreter there. So that's one of the things we're actively pursuing. In terms of transportation, looking at Uber and Lyft Health, these concierge services, we work very closely with these concierge services. A lot of patient reimbursement companies are now getting into that as well. And really, it's to ensure that participants can get to our clinic and they don't have any barriers. And so this is something we do all the time for our patients. Building trust and educating patients, that is the tough one. And that is a bit harder. It comes step by step, and we have further slides to look at strategies of how specifically to do that. But that's a really tough one. And sometimes it's on a case-by-case basis, and it's these little strides that we make that help. And I can give you a little story here of an example. We had a patient on a participant on a vaccine trial, and literally her family thought that the vaccine was the sign of the devil and was very upset that she had this. But with a bit of education, and we literally said, go back to your family and ask them if any of them have a scar on their shoulder. And it turns out they did. And she said, this is no different. This is the scar you got from a vaccine that was for smallpox years ago. And the family instantly was like, oh, and they changed their mindset and they understood, and it was okay. And that was just a one case scenario, but these little bridges that we build are so critical and important. Having community outreach, and we'll discuss ways to do that in a minute, because that's so critical. Flexible trial visits, having visits on Saturdays, having visits in the evening, early morning. People who are underserved often have jobs with very little flexibility. And so this is where you can help out in that way. And then looking at protocol and budget adaptations. We just talked about how you develop a protocol and the lack of insurance, and there has to be ways to look at a protocol to make it more inclusive for everyone coming on study, but also look at ways in which when we're looking at budgets and we're looking at things that are quote unquote standard of care, they may not be if someone doesn't have insurance. And we need to really take a look at this and address this when we're developing the protocol, the schedule of assessments, and looking at budgets for study sites. I'm going to just take a deep breath there and pause and see if anyone has any comments to that before I move on.
You can move on, Deborah, and we can ask you. I'm sure I'll for sure will be asking you questions.
Absolutely. I just wanted to give everyone a chance because I tend to speak a lot, as you can tell, I'm passionate. So looking at strategies to enroll diversity in clinical trials. So community engagement is key. Working with your local churches, the YMCA, food bank, patient service nonprofits, having community outreach coordinators. And I told this story to the ladies earlier when we were talking about one of our outreach coordinators is an African-American lady living in a senior's residence. And she told us she had never been treated so kindly or so nicely by anyone in her entire life in the medical industry when she came to us. And because of that, she is constantly calling us, do you have any studies for my ladies? And so this is an elderly group, African-American, a lot of ladies, and they're looking to participate in research. But just that one connection has opened up a whole other group of people to us. And it's important to establish these partnerships and become part of your community. and working with the doctors. For example, in oncology, we work with community oncologists, and they refer patients into us because they know it's in the best interest of their patients. And these are patients that don't go to the necessarily big medical centers. They stay within their community to receive care. And so this affords them an opportunity to become, to participate in research and have hope and some options when they may not have any further options. So that's really important. Elevate your community. Participate in your community with one goal. The goal is to elevate the community, not the study. The study will enroll once you elevate your community. It has to be in that fashion. Develop outreach materials and educational resources that are culturally sensitive and accessible to diverse populations. So again, we go back to, language barriers and so on and so forth. And then collaborating with local community trusted healthcare providers. So physicians, nurses who are working in these communities, who are working with these potential participants. It's important to engage them, and their patients trust them. And so they can talk to them as well about research. So I just want to show you an example on this next slide. This is a Fall into Wellness event that we held at Tranquil Clinical Research. And you can see we had Manos Abiertos involved, which is a Hispanic group. The Rose Foundation, which provides mammograms for every few that are paid. One is given free to someone who needs it. The Houston Food Bank, the Blood Center, and it was a blood drive, a food drive, shoe drive, wellness coaching, healthy mind activities. There was all sorts of activities going on. But the point is, this wasn't about a specific study. This was a wellness event. This was so that people could get to know us, and people could get services, and people could contribute to their community and get to know one another. And becoming part of the community is so critical to be trusted and to earn the trust. And trust has to be earned. And so this is a big part of it. So again, when we look at some strategies to enroll diversity in clinical trials, again, inclusive study designs and trial results reporting. So allow as much flexibility and inclusion criteria as possible, and look at the study schedule as mentioned. But ensure participants are contacted with results post-study. This is a big one. A lot of times after the study ends, people tend to forget to contact participants to talk about the studies that have occurred, to disseminate those results, and that's really critical. Consultation with patients and patient advocacy groups, and that's where Ella shines here and what she does, and really just, having that patient voice, even at the level when you're starting with protocol design. That is so critical. Obviously informed consent, but really ensuring participants fully understand the research process, their rights, and the benefits of participation. The first thing we say to any potential participant when they walk into our medical facility is, our primary goal, our primary focus is your safety, rights, and well-being. This is what we are here for. That is critical for us. That is our number one job. And we reiterate this to every potential participant before we even start the informed consent process, because that is our primary job, our patients' rights, safety, and well-being. Transparency and honesty, maintaining open and honest dialogue, that is critical as well. And I can't say enough about this, because just providing clear information about the study, the objectives of the study, any potential risks, benefits, this informed consent process is so important. And as a facility, as an institution, we are very invested in this process. We have about a 99% acceptance rate when we consent someone, and that's because we do such a good job, and we really discuss the study and ensure our potential participants know what they're getting into, and know what it's all about, and trust us. And that's really important. Obviously, patient education is important, and that's, an ongoing process. Again, getting out there in the community is a way to educate patients. So that's really important. And we talked about reducing some of the barriers. Patient stipends help. to reduce some of the barriers. Transportation support, as we talked about, flexible trial schedules, as we talked about. And again, that goes back to when you're building a protocol, building as much of a flexible trial schedule as you can. And then from a site perspective, we also have to be flexible in how we bring our population in. So basically, at Tranquil, we do focus on wellness of our patient. As we mentioned, we focus on their safety, rights, and well-being. The well-being should be palpable. Your potential participants should know they are safe. They need to have confidence in your research center. They need to have confidence that the staff are there for them, serving them, will protect their rights, will protect their well-being, and working towards their overall wellness. So it's not just participating in a study. We want to ensure their overall wellness and their wellness as an individual. And that makes all the difference too. When people know that you care, it makes such a difference. It can't just be a transaction. The caring involved has to be there, and it has to be palpable to participants. And people can feel the trust, and they can feel when people are genuine. And that's what we are consistently trying to do at our facility. We're really trying to make a difference for underserved populations, and really try to elevate minority populations, women, anyone who's underserved, and it can be socioeconomic status as well. So with that, I do have a few resources that I've put on here, which I can provide if anyone wants them. But with that, I wanted to just close out my session and open it up to questions and discussions. I know other people certainly have comments about this, and Ella and Julie, I'd like to get your take on it as well.
Thank you very much, Deborah. This has been amazing. So many insights here, and I have a lot of questions already, but personally wanted to say that I loved the examples you shared and patient experiences, and I know Ella will have a lot to say there about it, and so is Julie. I very much liked how you showed how important it is to have those champions within each community that really serve as bridges, right, between patients and the sites and the CROs and the sponsors, those key people who are trusted and can advocate for those patients who are in a vulnerable situation. So yeah, let me kick off this panel discussion by asking our panelists to add their comments to Deborah's presentation.
Yeah, so I can go ahead and start. First off, great points. I mean, we could probably spend hours diving into each of those. From an IRB perspective, what I think about comes down to the trust, and it comes down to making sure that people have information so that they make the decision. And when you bring those two things together, I think the results are pretty powerful with what you've been able to do. 99% success rate means that you're spending time, they trust you, and you're giving them information. And that's part of the reason why, after 15 years in the IRB space, I decided to come back to the IRB space, because I felt like we had this tremendous opportunity in front of us. We're coming out of a pandemic, and for the first time in decades, people are talking about clinical trials in the social media and in the news, and people are understanding, what does it mean? How do new vaccines get approved? How do they get tested? They're talking about them in shows that we watch on TV. And, I felt really compelled that, there's a lot of bad things that happen in research, and Tuskegee is just one of the many examples that created distrust. But we also in healthcare have a lot of distrust that came out of this. I was reading an article the other day that said that the trust in just a standard healthcare setting went from 70% before COVID to down to 40% afterwards. And so how do we remedy that? We get good information, we provide education, we help people understand. We can't put an informed consent in front of them. Tell them to read it and let us know if we have questions. We've got to meet them where they're at, and that includes the patient advocates, the community representatives. It takes time. So I think all the things you're doing are spot on. I would just say that when I had somebody challenge a company recently, and they said, think about your own employees in your company. We offer paid time off. We offer time for a volunteer. Do we offer time for people to participate in trials? Because if we don't, they're taking, quote, vacation time, taking sick time to want to go be in a trial. Yeah, and there's not enough people who want to be in clinical trials, and that's what we have to fix. So thank you for fighting the good fight. I'd love to hear from Ella as well.
If I could chime in, Deborah, I know you got off mute, but I couldn't agree more with all of the points that both Deborah you made in your presentation and Julie you just added to. To kind of focus into on that, like focus on wellness piece that you really mentioned. I think empathy for the patient's lived experience, with dealing with their condition on a day-to-day basis. That empathy for that experience really has to be the root of all healthcare interactions, when that's the patient that's going to the clinical trial site and interacting with, the nurse and staff there, even more on a larger scale, just coming from the sponsor. And, they have to, when designing and developing the study design, it's important to think about, okay, what would be best suited for this patient community? What would reduce burdens as much as possible and facilitate, and support their, participation, right? That means how can we provide compensation or support for travel? I think another piece here and weaving in the, the piece on diversity and the need for equity is that, a lot of marginalized communities don't have access to care. And really, how can we emphasize and focus on using clinical research as a care option? Participating in clinical research can be a way by which these patients can get access to, physicians and be, have as best and adequate care as possible. So I think that's a really important piece too, is how we can develop these relationships, build that trust, and make clinical research a piece of the healthcare environment, the care environment, and doing so by, starting one patient at a time. I love that example that you gave, Deborah, of that experience, with the one patient that you really had that personal connection with, or your team had that personal connection with, and really explaining, what does it mean to get a vaccine, and what does that mean for, it's just demystifying and kind of reducing these barriers for and building this trust. And I think that that's really, really the most important way and the key by which we can really start to bring patients more enrolled into trials and, move trials forward at a faster rate, because ultimately, the goal is to accelerate trials and bring about valuable and novel therapeutics for patients that need them the most.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ella. Yes, I think you made an amazing point, and quickly jumping in here, because I think what you just said about the different challenges between healthy population as opposed to people with diseases and living with those diseases, this contradiction between healthy volunteers in a study, okay, and then people who are coming to the study as a last option. But I guess no one considers clinical trials as part of their health option or health journey, like this middle part of the chain that seems to be missing. So I'm wondering, and Ella, this is mainly for you, how patient advocates collaborate with sponsors and researchers to ensure that clinical trial designs and those outreach strategies are inclusive and also culturally sensitive?
You know, I really think it takes an effort from the side of the sponsors and other stakeholders to think about how they can effectively engage that, this particular population early on, before we're, have the protocol written and we have to go back and make amendments and after the fact, and, the time and resource burden that is on all parties. So I think it's really, a responsibility of the healthcare industry and then sponsors specifically to think about how can they effectively engage with, and Deborah alluded to this too in her presentation, engage with these patient advocacy organizations, engage with grassroots community efforts, and understand the pain points and the needs of the population that they're aiming to serve or conduct a trial in. And, and of course, I think another piece of this too is, obviously one solution or one type of modification or one consideration may not apply to all patients, right? But I think it's important to understand the community as a whole, right? That's the cultural unique aspects culturally for different communities, whether that is, financial or social barriers. And when this, generally is understood, then once you kind of have a good idea and the patients aren't involved in that process, the community, then from there you can think about how can we provide or weave in that optionality into clinical trial design, where maybe one patient, doesn't necessarily need transportation to be picked up from a clinical trial site, or sorry, from their home and, taken in an Uber to the trial site. Maybe they live close enough, but maybe they instead, have not participated in a trial and they need, they have their caregiver that is available to go with them and they just want that person there. So maybe provide that support for this person to accommodate them or accompany them. So I think it, building in the ability to, serve the nuanced needs of a particular individual, in addition to those more broader encompassing cultural, financial and social barriers and aspects of patients' communities.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Tailoring the study to the patients and not the other way around, possibly. So, Julie, I'm wondering how this all affects you as an IRB and how can you drive progress here?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very encouraged to see that the FDA is supporting the diversity action plans, but it's not a new topic. It's been something that has been a requirement for a long time. Part of the criteria for approval that IRBs have to look at when they're evaluating studies is the selection of the patients equitable? And there's a lot of challenges in that, especially when you end up in your early phase trials where you may need a certain population, that healthy volunteer population, and it needs to be very limited in diversity because of statistical analysis. And the more diversity that you bring early in the phase, the more patients you're going to have to enroll, the more people you're going to have to expose to potentially a drug that you don't have a good safety profile on. So there are reasons why certain trials are not appropriate for opening it up to the wide population. But that combined with back in since the beginning of time for IRBs and Belmont Report and ethical principles has been this concept of justice, and those that bear the burden should be the ones that have the benefit from these drugs. So we can't put our head in the sand anymore and say, okay, well, we're only going to test it in this subset of patients in phase 3, and then we'll just hope that once it gets to market, we'll get enough data. So I really think FDA's guidance is pushing this. Now, I think one of the questions was, well, what happens if they don't have enough diversity in their patient pool? What kind of consequences are there? Well, it's not mandated that there's a certain percentage of different demographics, but what could happen is obviously FDA could have a lot more scrutiny, could take longer to get your drug to market. They could request that you do additional trials. Some of those might be post-market trials, obviously, but they could also limit what your drug is approved for. So it could have some labeling consequences as well, where, it could say it's not been tested in this group, or, they may have to do additional testing. So it's something to certainly get ahead of. I'd encourage you to get connected with groups that are helping you be proactive in designing these trials. Ella's a tremendous resource. There's a lot of different patient advocacy groups that we work with as well to try to think about, okay, we've got a phase 2 trial. It's looking really good. We want to move into phase 3. Let's start asking patients with that disease now, what are the challenges to be in a study? If for those that follow me on LinkedIn, I just reposted Clinical Trials for All is a great organization, and they've been posting some statistics about the patient challenges. And one of them was that I think it's like 70% of sites are at least 2 hours away from patients. So 2 hours round trip, and that's thinking if they're healthy enough to make that travel on their own. They have, reliable transportation, the cost of getting there. I mean, these are all things that we need to think about before we start rolling out that phase 3 trial.
Yeah, I would agree completely there. And I'm wondering, do we know how does the FDA plan to ensure that sponsors set these realistic enrollment goals and how to achieve them effectively, really?
Well, with anything, it's guidance, right? It's FDA guidance. It's not law. So they don't have, they can apply more scrutiny, but at the end of the day, they don't have, the jurisdiction with guidance to cite anything. So I think it's just going to be, more scrutiny, more follow-up, post-market trials to really making sure that there is that representation.
Good. Deborah, is there anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, well, a lot, but to unwrap that, I think, the FDA's response, I think we are going to see, my gut feeling is that they are going to require more post-marketing studies, as Julie mentioned. I can see that happening a lot more in the future. And but just to Ella's point, a really important point, that clinical trials and research is healthcare. And that's a message we need to ensure is getting out to the population as well. So I really think that that's critical and important as well. But yeah, sponsors need input, and as Ella said, from patients, and they can also get input from sites. So from our perspective as a clinical research unit, as a phase 1 unit, we do help sponsors a lot because we interact with patients. We can provide suggestions for these types of things. How can we increase diverse enrollment in underserved populations, and what are the things we can do? And as Ella mentioned, there are different things, and depending on the people, we often see this at our clinic, and we facilitate having caregivers come in with patients, and we facilitate in some cases with rare disease studies, the entire family comes in. We ensure that the entire family is comfortable and that they're fed and that they're taken care of. And and little things like the potential participant or the participant may have a favorite drink they want to have on hand, but these little things, these things to make everyone comfortable, go such a long way towards helping individuals participate in research, all individuals participate in research. And I think I saw a question about transportation and reducing some barriers to that. And as Julie, I think, mentioned 2 hours away. We're lucky in our area that most of our patients and participants are not 2 hours away because of where we're located, but we do have a huge catchment area. Other than Uber Health, there are stipends we can do. We can, provide taxi services, Uber Health, stipends. But a big thing I don't think we talked about, and this is a whole other webinar we could get into, is really decentralized type trials, in the sense of taking the trial to the patient. And when you look at a schedule of assessments, do they need to be coming into the clinic or traveling that 2 hours every single day? Or are there ways that we can have them, take their medication at home and do a televisit type thing? Or, there's so many options and so much flexibility that we really need to pay attention to that, and to patients' needs on trials.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that the entire family is involved and it's not just the isolated patient, right? I have one question before we possibly move into the questions from the audience. That, thank you, lady. I know you went ahead of those and answered a couple. We spoke about ICFs and how we can not really expect patients to, okay, read the ICF, go through those documents, and we take for granted that they understood everything. So do you think sponsors can use lay summaries to address specific concerns or misconceptions that prevent diverse populations from enrolling in trials?
Absolutely. And we've seen, and I know Julie could probably talk a lot about this too, and Ella, and I'll let them speak, but we've seen ways that we can get videos approved by IRBs. We've seen different methods. When you're talking pediatrics, it's very different, but underserved populations, videos that educate on what a clinical trial is, and definitely other ways to get lay summaries out. And that is so critical, that language, and getting it appropriate for the population, for the audience you're looking at. We were talking, Maria, about just even different types of Spanish, and the awareness that Spanish
Yes.
from Puerto Rico is not the same as Spanish from somewhere else, right? And this is so critical. I'll pause there and let Julie and Ella jump in, because I'm sure they have a lot to say on this too.
I'll just quickly add that I think, lay summaries are very valuable in, disseminating information post-trial for, the patient population that participated. But it's also important for the broader community to understand, and gain more, health literacy and just general understanding about research that's taking place for their population. And I think the challenge that exists is, and I think having various formats. So like Deborah, you just said, like video format, not just necessarily written, because I think that not everybody absorbs information the same way. And then on top of that too, is making sure that it's displayed or disseminated on various channels and through various different means. It is sent from the patient advocacy organizations, that they have access to this and that they can share with their community. That it's, through social media as well. That's another, I think, valuable way to share this type of information. And we have to make sure that these can't obviously be, behind any sort of like paywalls or in journals or things like that. Like, it has to be very accessible. And that's, I think, the way that we're going to, in creating these materials, going to have the most effectiveness with it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And in fact, at Univo, we've got a pretty long list of topics that we plan to get out to the research community. And we've talked about, is it a podcast? Is it a webinar? Is it printed material? Is it, something that's they can easily get to on their mobile device? We have the ability for us to get information out quickly has completely changed in the last 10 years. So, when I first started in the IRB business, we had pamphlets that we used to print, and we would send them out to all of the sites that, that we worked with, to put in the waiting rooms to say, okay, what is a clinical trial? And what are some things that I need to think about? And what are some questions I should ask during this consenting process? And we've gotten away from that. We put some stuff on some websites here and there, but we're not doing a good enough job. And so that's a big initiative for us right now as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we even have social media these days where we can display information in this plain language that patients can understand and relate to. And coming back to Deborah's example on the different types of Spanish, if you are a high educated person, you may understand the differences, but patients. I mean, we have pediatric patients, patients who hadn't had the chance to go to school and may get confused by a different variation of even their own language. So yeah, this has been interesting. Thank you, ladies. And I think we need to move now to questions from the audience. Thanks again, because I know you already replied a couple of those. I have one here that is related to transportation that we talked a couple of minutes ago. So someone is asking, can decentralization enhance diversity in clinical trials? Do you think that this can be helpful in a way? I would say yes initially, but I'll leave the experts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but, you know, and having a trial site where we are, decentralization doesn't necessarily mean everything's done remotely, but you can have a combination thereof. And we're starting to see a lot of that in trials we're doing now, where there's a combination of on-site and remote. And you take a look again at when we were talking about the trial schedule, okay, when does the patient or participant actually need to come into a clinic? And when can we do things remotely or in a quote unquote decentralized fashion? Yeah, that's really critical. Julie?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, I think this is the way of the future. And we've talked a lot in, you know, in the IRB space of how do the way that we protect patients and support them in decentralized modalities is certainly different than what a traditional trial used to be. And so we need to understand that better. I will tell you there's some government organizations that are looking at how, like, what are the best methods for decentralized components at a trial? Is it e-consent? Is it home health? Is it you know, kind of virtual visits? Or what, like, how do those specific technologies or processes compare to a traditional? And they're looking at it because, you know, obviously, you know, we're not immune to another pandemic and by any means, or there may be some regional healthcare issues where we need to go back to executing you know, trials in a decentralized way. And so we want to have that data to look at and say, okay, well, we know when we use e-consent, here's the benefit of it, you know, and in a very, you know, aggregate way. So we're partnering with some groups that are looking at that. I'm very excited to see what the results come out to, because I do think that decentralized trials is the way, decentralized components, not, like you said, not 100%, but that's the way of the future, and how we enroll more people and help them participate.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that, you know, we saw with COVID the really quick ramp up of telehealth and the way that, you know, clinics were able to pivot and, you know, see patients, you know, remotely, and you know, and that kind of translated too into clinical research. And how are we gonna, during that time, we really had to think about how we would continue, you know, moving these trials forward in a decentralized way, because that was all we could do. And I think now there's been, to some degree, maybe a little bit of regression as far as, you know, relying more on the traditional ways of in-person visits. And, you know, I think it's just because that's how it's been, you know, processes have been developed. It's what we know, it's what we kind of resort back to, the way we do things. But again, right, to Julie's point, I think it's important to weave in elements of decentralized trials and, you know, having that, making sure though, and this is like the caveat, is that making sure that with, you know, the age of digitization and these decentralized approaches, that we don't lose still the human connection, right? Like as Deborah alluded to, those examples of where the patient was in, you know, at the clinical trial site, and there was that opportunity for that engagement and just that relationship building. I think that that's still, so that has to remain, and that's really important. So how we can think about optimally, you know, utilizing these elements to ease the burden on patients of, you know, having this decentralized approach, having, you know, nurses come out to the patient's homes, not having to do as much travel, fitting into their life and their schedule and their day-to-day lives, while still making sure that ultimately the patient feels that they are, a part, that it's not just them on their own, being a part of this research as a guinea pig, but it's that it's really still a collaborative and holistic experience where their input or their involvement is valued, and there is still those touch points and that communication ongoing. So really finding that balance.
Yeah, and there's also another guidance that the FDA put out that kind of goes hand in hand with that, and it's more of a point of care guidance of working closely with healthcare providers to support the clinical trial. So if you think about, somebody goes to the local pharmacy, it's like what activities could be done at that local pharmacy that's maybe 5 minutes down the road, and could they see a healthcare provider there instead of having to go 2 hours, to the site? And how do we look at those types of resources to reduce the burden to the patient? And I think that's another way of kind of interweaving the concept of being in a clinical trial as part of your healthcare journey, within our world.
Yeah, and not just like help patients with that burden, but also the caregivers, which play a key role there, I would say. Well, we only have 3 minutes. So, Deborah, would you like to add any closing remarks before I go and share a couple of comments before we leave?
Just closing remarks. Again, thanks to everyone and the panel for being on. But I really think, again, this question goes back to just the idea of the trust and the building of relationships. And I think that is, again, one of the most critical aspects. And it's not just, it involves work, it's not just something that's going to happen. It has to involve work. And as a site, we really feel it's our goal. It's so important to us to be part of our community and to give back and to provide these services. So, we understand we're a research site, we're a research facility, but at the same time, we're part of the community, and we want to ensure that we give back and we do everything we can to elevate that community. And I think if you come at it with that mindset, you're always going to find ways, new, innovative ways to make things work. And that's what we're constantly doing, day by day, patient by patient. And as Ella said, it differs from patient to patient, study by study. We are finding ways to serve the underserved and ensure that they, feel like they're collaborating with us, as Ella said, as a team in their healthcare.
No, that's amazing. And it's clear that these new guidelines on diversity are a big step forward. But here's the thing, none of this works without breaking down all the barriers we have mentioned. And for us, in relation with what we do here at Vistatec, one of those barriers is language. Think about it. If someone can't fully understand what a clinical trial is asking of them and how it might benefit them, how can we expect them to participate at all? That's where language plays such a crucial role, and this is part of the work we do here at Vistatec. It's not just getting the words right. It's about making sure no matter what language the patient and the caregivers speak, they feel informed, respected, and on top of that, empowered to take part of that trial. And we're not just meeting a regulatory requirement here. We're not just ticking a box. We are creating real opportunities from people from all parts of the world that speak different languages, and we are contributing to research. So thank you, ladies. This has been amazing. I know we can talk about this for hours, so Thank you so much for your time, Deborah, Julie, and Ella. We appreciate your input, and thank you very much to our audience for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next episode of Life Sciences in Focus.